You know, the horror genre isn't all just exploding heads and rotting corpses. Sometimes we think the very deepest of thoughts. And I'm not just talking about deep thoughts like who would win in a fight between Pinhead and Freddy Krueger. No, today we're thinking thoughts even deeper than that. I've recently been reading this book, The Practicing Stoic, a Philosophical User's Manual by Ward Farnsworth. Though it's really nothing to do with the horror genre per se, the author is known for writing about philosophy, rhetoric, law, and chess, not a horror novel to be found. Nevertheless, it got me to thinking about the horror genre. In particular, the book's fourth chapter concerns the Stoics' attitude toward that most ghastly of all specters, death itself. And, as it happens, I found that much of their advice lines up with the psychology and philosophy of the horror genre. So that's our topic for today. Before we get to thinking thoughts about death and horror, we need to understand the basics of what Stoicism actually is, because it's commonly misunderstood. A lot of people think of the Stoics as either cold and unemotional or grim, both of which are actually inaccurate. So as Farnsworth explains, Stoicism got its name because Zeno of Citium, the founder of the school, did his teaching in a public colonnade or porch, Stoa, overlooking the Agora of Athens. Stoicism was known on this account as the philosophy of the porch, as opposed to the philosophy of the garden, that of Epicurus, or the philosophy of the academy, that of Plato, or the philosophy of the Lyceum, that of Aristotle, with each name referring to the place where the teachings of the school were imparted. So if Stoicism sounds too forbidding because of the word's popular meaning, you could try telling your family that you're studying the philosophy of the porch. They might like that. Rather than the grim and unemotional philosophy of modern understanding, Stoicism, as it was originally developed, was much more about controlling our own thoughts by carefully analyzing our psychology and controlling how we react to things outside of our own control. In that way, it aligns with a lot of modern psychological thought, though the Stoics and the psychologists would often use very different words to describe what they're talking about. To a psychologist trained in cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, for instance, many psychological problems stem from unhealthy ways of thinking, which lead to unhealthy ways of behaving. The treatment for many psychological dysfunctions, then, is to first be aware of and then to correct one's own distorted thinking. The Stoics say much the same thing, though using different terminology. They talk about externals, things outside of one's own control, but that can affect one's well-being. As Marcus Aurelius put it, if any external thing causes you distress, it is not the thing itself that troubles you, but your own judgment about it. And this you have the power to eliminate now. Indeed, though the Stoics have no problem expressing preferences regarding certain externals, it is, for instance, better to be fed than hungry, better to be rich than poor, etc., they caution against obsessing over externals and letting those define one's life, comparing the liberation from externals even to liberation from slavery. As Seneca said, "Show me who is not a slave. One is a slave to lust, another to avarice, another to ambition, and all are slaves to fear. I will name you an ex-consul who is slave to a little old woman, a millionaire who is slave to a serving maid. I will show you youths of the noblest birth in serfdom to pantomime players. No servitude is more disgraceful than that which is self-imposed." Though that was the barest of bare-bones explanations of Stoicism, it does give us enough background to begin to discuss how the Stoics treat the topic of death. Their approach is twofold. They view it first as an external, and therefore subject it to the same kind of analysis they would any other external. Secondly, though, they view it, perhaps surprisingly, as a source of inspiration. For the purposes of this discussion, we'll follow Farnsworth's method of tracing Stoic thought beginning with the fear of death and ultimately leading to death as inspiration. Along the way, we'll identify some interesting parallels with the horror genre. We begin by correctly identifying death as a frightening prospect. Though their thinking evolved beyond this stage, the Stoics were not blind to the terrifying prospect of extinction. Seneca wrote, "No one doubts that death has in it something that inspires terror, so that it shocks even our souls, which nature has so molded that they love their own existence. For otherwise there would be no need to prepare ourselves and to whet our courage, to face that towards which we should move with a sort of voluntary instinct, precisely as all men tend to preserve their existence." He also wrote, "Death belongs among those things that are not evils in truth, but still have an appearance of evil. For a love of self is implanted in us, and a desire for existence and survival, and a dread of disintegration. Death seems to rob us of many good things, and to remove us from all we have come to know. And there is another element that estranges us from death. We are already familiar with the present, but are ignorant of the future into which we will go, and we shrink from the unknown. Even if death is something indifferent then, it is nevertheless a thing that cannot be easily ignored." That could almost be a description of the entire horror genre. We strive for the comfort of the known, and we fear the uncertainty of the unknown, which is why horror movies and horror literature, and even horror games, are most effective when they keep the big bad, so to speak, secret from the audience for as long as possible. Death itself can be viewed as perhaps the ultimate fear because it is the ultimate unknown. However strongly we may hold our religious views, or our non-religious views for that matter, no one can ever return from death to report from the other side. It can never truly be known to us. And it's final in a way that almost nothing else in human existence ever is or ever could be. But the Stoics don't stop by acknowledging the fear of death. They move forward, encouraging a fearlessness of death. Seneca advises that fearlessness of death is crucial for a proper life. He writes, "What then should he study? That which is helpful against all weapons, against every kind of foe, contempt for death." He also writes, "He who has learned to die has unlearned slavery. He is above any power and certainly beyond it. What terrors have prisons and bonds and bars for him?" And, "Make life as a whole agreeable to yourself then, by banishing all worry about it. No good thing makes its possessor happy unless his mind is prepared for its loss, and nothing is easier to let go of than that which, once gone, cannot be missed." And finally, we must make ready for death before we make ready for life. How then do we conquer the fear of death? The Stoics offer several pieces of advice, some of which correspond with aspects of the horror genre. Farnsworth traces these correctives through the following categories. 1. Recognition that the fear of death is irrational because its nature is fundamentally unknown to us. As Plato said, "To fear death, gentlemen, is nothing else than to think one is wise when one is not." 2. Recognition that death brings painlessness. That is, though the process of dying might be painful, we have no reason to think death itself is. Seneca said, "Death is coming to you. It would be a thing to dread if it could stay, but necessarily it either doesn't come or it comes and goes." Of course, those who have religious beliefs in certain kinds of afterlife may not necessarily agree with this proposition, but we must all agree, at the very least, that there's no certainty about it. Despite the overall thesis of this video that the horror genre is fundamentally in alignment with Stoic philosophy regarding death, this might be one point where the horror genre diverges from Stoic teachings. The Stoics regard death as painless. The horror genre gives us visions like Hellraiser, Drag Me to Hell, and so forth. 3. Recognition of death as a natural transition, such as the seasons or the transformation of matter. I would add the argument that because horror as a genre is both obsessed with death and often follows established narrative structures, it could help us understand and navigate this kind of transition or transformation. 4. Comparison of the experience of non-existence after death to the experience of non-existence prior to birth. 5. Comparisons of the human fear of death to non-human animals' fearlessness of death, even though death is inevitable for all of them. 6. Contemplation that death can bring a relief from the pains and frustrations of life. Indeed, as Seneca said, the best thing eternal law ever ordained was one entrance into life, but many exits. Must I await the cruelty, either of disease or of man, when I can depart in the midst of torture and shake off my troubles? This is the one reason why we cannot complain of life. It keeps none of us against our will. Humanity is well situated in that none are unhappy except by their own fault. Live if it suits you. If not, you can go back where you came from. I hasten to point out that though I can't necessarily fault his logic, I certainly don't agree with Seneca on this point. However, it is a point that bears some similarity to certain entries in the horror genre. In our favorite genre, we've all seen depictions of suffering so great that death becomes a welcome release rather than a feared adversary. 7. Recognition of the progressive nature of death. As Seneca said, we do not suddenly fall on death, but advance toward it by slight degrees. We die every day. For every day a little of our life is taken from us. Even when we are growing, our life is on the wane. We lose our childhood, then our boyhood, and then our youth. Right up to yesterday, all past time is lost time. The very day we are now spending is shared between ourselves and death. It is not the last drop that empties the water clock, but all that has flowed out already. 8. Recognition that quality of life is more important than quantity of life. Seneca said, "What matters is not how long you live, but how well." And often, living well means that you cannot live long. That's an important message for all of us to recognize because we don't indeed know the duration of our own lives, but the quality of our lives is much more readily within our control. It also means something deeper. To live well is not merely to live for enjoyment, but to live with purpose. Viktor Frankl, Holocaust survivor, psychiatrist, and author of Man's Search for Meaning, argued that finding a purpose in life could allow humans to contend with almost any adversity, including what he witnessed in the Nazi concentration camps. The horror genre gives us plenty of food for thought in this regard. Often the characters in horror stories must sacrifice the quantity of their own lives in the pursuit of that kind of meaning. Often the preservation of another character's life, or the quality of such a character's life. 9. Recognition of death as an equalizer. Death comes for us all, as the horror genre so viscerally reminds us. Man or woman, rich or poor, noble or ignoble, the horror genre seldom spares anyone from the reality, or at least the threat, of death. Seneca expressed the same thought in different terms. Toward death, he said, at different paces moves the entire crowd that now squabbles in the forum, that looks on at the theaters, that prays in the temples. Both those you love and revere, and those you despise, one heap of ashes will make equal. But these modes of thinking about death, these correctives to what the Stoics would view as incorrect thinking about death, are not the only parallels between Stoic thought about death and the horror genre. Indeed, these ideas lay the groundwork for the argument that I really want to make, and that argument is this. The horror genre is uniquely positioned to prepare us to grapple with the prospect of death in the way the Stoics would recommend. How does the horror genre do this? Partly, it keeps us constantly cognizant of these kinds of thoughts, whether explicitly or implicitly. Seneca had a lot to say about the proximity of death, writing, Reflect that a bandit or an enemy can put a knife to your throat, and though he is not your master, every slave has the power of life and death over you. Therefore I declare to you, whoever scorns his own life is master of yours. And you are mistaken if you think that only on an ocean voyage is there a very slight space between life and death. No, the distance between is just as narrow everywhere. It is not everywhere that death shows himself so near at hand, yet everywhere he is near at hand. And finally, I say that there is no lasting peace for anything that can perish and cause to perish. But I place this fact in the category of solace, actually a very powerful solace, since fear without remedy is what foolish men have. If you wish to fear nothing, consider that everything is to be feared. Let me repeat that last phrase. If you wish to fear nothing, consider that everything is to be feared. Does that not sound like a ringing endorsement of the horror genre? That's what we do every day. Using the fictional worlds of our horror stories, we confront the fear lurking not only in the extraordinary and repellent, but in the mundane and unremarkable. The Final Destination movies made an entire series based on this premise. We don't need to fear only the unusual, the haunted house, the ghost, the demon, the alien, the zombie apocalypse. But the mundane. We need to fear every little thing in life. The airplane trip, the roller coaster ride, driving on the freeway, the tanning salon, the kitchen, the party, the swimming pool. Literally anything and everything. While it's possible for fear of everything to turn into a debilitating psychological disorder, of course, the healthier mind takes this information and realizes that if everything can be feared, then perhaps nothing must be feared. The horror genre accomplishes for us what the Stoics, like Seneca, advised for us. By using fiction to harmlessly explore the possibilities, we immunize ourselves against the fears that could cripple us. And then we may be able to take their other advice and focus more on the quality of our lives rather than merely the quantity, in light of the fact that, other than maintaining a reasonably healthy lifestyle, we actually have very little control over the latter in the first place. It's possibly for this reason that the Stoics told their students, followers, or readers to keep the prospect of death in mind. They argue that it keeps us properly oriented and virtuous. Seneca said, "Nothing will give you so much help toward moderation as the frequent thought that life is short and that the little we have is uncertain. Whatever you are doing, be mindful of death." He also said, "No one can have a peaceful life who thinks too much about lengthening it, or who believes that living through many consulships is a great blessing. Rehearse this thought every day, so that you may be able to peacefully give up this life to which so many clutch and cling, just as those snatched away by a rushing stream clutch and cling to briars and sharp rocks." Montaigne was even clearer on the matter. "Let us strip death of its strangeness. Let us spend time with it. Let us get used to it. Let us have nothing on our minds more often. At every moment, let us imagine death in all of its aspects. When a horse stumbles, when a tile falls, when a pin pricks us, even slightly, let us immediately turn over this thought: what if that had been death itself?" And Epicurus was particularly succinct when he advised simply, think on death. This intimacy with death may seem morbid to some, but I can tell you from experience that often those of us who spend our lives immersed in the horror genre, constantly thinking dark and disturbing or terrifying thoughts, despite our outward strangeness, are often the most well-adjusted and level-headed people I know, the occasional fracas in the horror-related social media pages notwithstanding. The horror genre allows us to do as Seneca and the Stoics advised. We develop an intimacy with death. Perhaps that seems morbid to some people, but it seems quite sane to me, and for the same reason it did to the Stoics. Death is inevitable, so we do better to confront it directly than to pretend it doesn't exist. The Stoics may not have had the horror genre as we know it today, but I have a feeling they would have been fans. By focusing our attention on death, we allow ourselves to live our lives. Marcus Aurelius offered this blunt criticism. You are going to die at any minute, and yet you still are not simple and straightforward, nor do you have peace of mind, nor are you free from suspicion that you will be hurt by external things, nor are you kind to everyone, nor do you see that being wise consists solely in being just. Seneca offered a similar thought from a less accusatory perspective. Take as much as fortune gives, remembering that it comes with no guarantee. Snatch the pleasures your children bring. Let your children in turn find delight in you, and drain joy to the dregs without delay. Nothing is promised for this night. Nay, I have granted too long an extension, not even for this hour. We must hurry. The enemy is right behind us. On that note, I thank you sincerely for spending some of your so limited time here on my channel. Please do like this video and subscribe so you can learn even more about what the horror lifestyle can do for your own sanity and well-being, or just to learn about some good horror books or movies you might want to check out. As a quick reminder, if you happen to be watching this when it's originally posted in May of 2021, I have a contest going on right now until the end of the month in which I'm giving away a big stack of horror novels. There's a link down in the What's It to the video in which I announced the contest, so be sure to check that out and participate if you haven't already. And finally, allow me to remind you, as the Stoics likely would have, to take care and stay scared.